From the studios in Joplin, Missouri, Good News Productions International presents Venture in Faith. Outstanding Christians of our generation telling their own story of how God has worked in their lives. Your host, Boyce Moten.
Yesterday I met Duane Miller for the first time. I didn't think I knew him, and within 60 seconds of talking to him I said, "I know you. You're the man whose voice God healed." And Duane, it reminded me of those stories in the Bible of Simon of Cyrene who carried the cross, or Mary Magdalene, out of whom Jesus had cast 7 demons, or Barnabas, who sold a piece of ground and laid the money at the apostles' feet. The early church had people who were well known or famous because of certain experiences in their lives. And the tape of your healing has been heard millions of times.
Yes, it has. The Lord has done an incredible thing, Boyce. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to come and visit with you today and yesterday as well.
And I'm certain that someone will be hearing the story for the very first time. So if you don't mind, would you go back and recount for our viewers the way that God set this up so that there could be no doubt about His hand in the whole matter?
Oh, I'll be happy to do that. I have no doubt about the sovereign grace of God. And if there is any reason for my existence today, it is to share with folks that God is still on the throne in the midst of all of our struggles and our storms. That's why I'm here. And I learned some lessons about compassion. You know, I think the only way you learn those lessons sometimes is going through things, not reading about them in books. The seminary doesn't always train us the way it attends to or attempts to. Life experience is important, and I've had one of those. I served on the staff at First Baptist Church in Houston, which is a very, very large church. Dr. John Bisagno is my pastor. And I served there for a good long time, 12 years, as various things. Ultimately, the director of married young adults was my title. That was my title, Dr. Bisagno used to say, but my job description was putty. If you've ever been staff in a church, you understand that job description. You do whatever's necessary to do.
And 12 years is almost a world's record.
Absolutely. In fact, I tease with him about the fact that I've been a member of the church only 4 years less than he's been there, so I have seniority as I'm there. While I was on the staff, we had a policy that said staff never teaches Sunday school. We just never did that. And there was a good reason for it. The church being large, I had roughly 2,000 adults every Sunday morning between the ages of 20 and 40 that were my responsibility for Sunday school. That was an average attendance in my division. And I had 52 Sunday school classes that I had to make sure had chalk and quarterlies and teachers and coffee and donuts, and you know, you got to do that in a Baptist Sunday school. You understand that. Anyhow, don't look at me in that tone of voice. The church policy was we did not teach because of that. We had a lot of administration to do. However, on one particular Sunday morning back in 1980, our large Sunday school class had about 200 members in it, and our teacher became ill on Sunday morning. And he called the church and said, "Listen, I can't get there." And so the church thrashed around and tried to find someone to teach that class. And when they could not come up with a teacher, they finally called Putty to go down there and fill in and teach that morning. And so I did that. And through a series of events, that teacher never returned to the class. He was ill for a long time. His illness was serious. And once he had recovered, he was transferred on his job to another city. And so he never came back to that Sunday school class. And I wound up filling in there for the next 6 years. They never would let me be the teacher because that was against policy, and you know how we are about policy. But they would let me fill in for 6 years. So I taught the class for 6 years. And that class became, and this is a good sense, it became a church within a church. If you've ever been on staff or ever pastored a church, you know that that's a threatening statement at times. When a group of people become a clique within a church, that's not good. But we became such a tight-knit fellowship of folks. And Brother John, Dr. Bisagno, let me pastor my Sunday school class as well as my division. So we became very close. Well, in 1986, I received a call from First Baptist Church in Brenham, Texas, which is about 75 miles from Houston, to come be the senior pastor of that congregation. My Sunday school class was not just overwhelmed with that decision. I think they would like me to have stayed and filled in till Jesus comes, I think is what they had in mind. But at any rate, the call came and I responded. Now, if any of your viewers have ever had Bluebell ice cream, they will understand that Brenham, Texas is the home of Bluebell ice cream. So when you get a call from a church in Brenham, Texas, you don't even have to pray about a decision like that. I mean, God is in that. You grab a bowl and a spoon and you head for Brenham, you're gone. So my Sunday school class bade me farewell, I thought. And I went to Brenham, and my first Sunday there as the senior pastor. This is a 150-year-old church now when I get there. Very serious little church. R.E.B. Baylor, for whom the university is named, pioneered that church. Has a very rich heritage and history. So as I walk out on the platform, my first Sunday as the senior pastor of this august little group, I look down at the congregation and I notice, now our church was one of those long, narrow Baptist churches, had the back rows in a different zip code. You understand you've been there. You've seen those? Okay. Well, I looked down in the first 3 pews in the section to my right as I stood at the pulpit. First 3 pews are filled with people from this Sunday school class in Houston. And they're laughing and kind of being themselves. You have to understand that they never were impressed with me. I was just Duane. That's all I've ever been to them. So they were just being themselves that morning. And it finally came my turn to preach. And as I walked to the pulpit, and I laid my Bible down, and I got about here with my first word as the senior pastor. They drape a banner over the privacy rail down here that reads, "Love you, yes, forgive you, never." And the choir's sitting up here thinking, who are these people down here? And that class, even with their silliness and their nonsense that morning, became such a part of us, those 6 years that I taught, that they never let go. During the next 4 years that I pastored that church, probably 5 out of every 9 Sundays would find somebody from that class that drove that 75 miles one way just to be in church with us on Sunday morning. We had become family, literally, and that maintains to this very day. They're the support group for my wife while I'm on the road, while I'm out in ministry. Wonderful people. Well, I served the church in Brenham for 4 years as pastor. Got up one morning in January of 1990, and when I got out of bed that morning, I felt just nasty. I had that feeling you get when you know you're coming down with something. I was achy, feverish, my throat was scratchy. I would really love to have just crawled back into bed and pulled the covers over my head. But I couldn't do that morning because I didn't have any putty down there to preach for me. I had to go do it. So I got out of bed and I got dressed and I headed for church. And we had 2 morning services. We had an early service at 8:30 and a late service at 11, and then Sunday night church as well. And that particular morning, I had planned my sermon around a song. Again, not unusual. I began singing professionally when I was 16. So music was a part of my ministry a long time before preaching became the focus of what I do. So that particular morning, I had woven a song and an outline together, and that was my message. Well, at the 8:30 service, I did my best and tried to sing the song and preach the message, but I didn't like the way it sounded, and I sure didn't like the way it felt in my throat. So at 11 o'clock, I just tried to get through my outline as quickly as I could, and by the time I got back to church Sunday night, my throat was so sore, and I had laryngitis, boys, that was so bad, I could barely speak. So I told the church that night, I told one of my deacons, I said, "Charlie, I can't handle the service tonight." And I'll never forget, he said, "Don't worry about it, preach, I'll handle it." And I want you to know that deacon, bless his heart, he did. He handled the whole service, including, he had a sermon outline tucked in the back of his Bible, and on about that much notice, he preached that night. And I tell folks as I travel about today, that's deaking, boy, that's first order deaking. And I'm proud of that brother. He blessed his pastor that night, he really did. Well, the church just prayed for me that night and sent me home. And for the next couple of weeks, I just endured the flu. It was ordinary intestinal flu. Everybody's had it at one time or another. You've had it. I've had it various times. And after about 2 weeks, all the intestinal problems cleared up. But I was still left with this horribly sore throat and difficulty in trying to speak. Well, 2 weeks into that, I decided, I probably ought to go get that checked out. You need to understand that I'm not one of these guys that runs to a doctor every time I stub my toe. That's not my style. So it took a couple of weeks of pain and agony for me to finally say, maybe I need to go see the doctor. And when I went to see a friend of mine who's a specialist in Houston, and he examined me, He told me that the infection in my bronchi was still very rampant and my throat was swollen almost completely shut. So he sent me back home with some stronger medication. 2 weeks later, I went back for another exam, and when he examined me again, he told me that the infection had cleared and that the swelling was gone and everything looked normal. But I was left with a pressure in my throat that the only way I know to describe to you is to tell you to grab your Adam's apple and squeeze it. Not enough to kill yourself, but just enough to make it uncomfortable. Your windpipe is right there. And if you do that, you'll sound like this. That's what I sounded like. That's what it felt like in my throat for the next 3 years of my life. And as I want to tell people, the reaction is, who signed me up for that? You know, as a preacher, your voice is kind of important to you. And when I began to have throat problems and voice problems, at the time in my life when my ministry was, in a sense, at its apex, if you understand what I mean by that, I'm prime time for my ministry. I've gotten experience and my education and my background, and I should be in my most productive years. And suddenly, I can't speak clearly, and it's an effort to try to make any sound at all. Well, my friend thought he had a diagnosis almost immediately, but he wanted someone to corroborate that for me, Boyce, and so he sent me over to the Baylor College of Medicine there in Houston. I don't know how familiar you all may be with our medical center in Houston, but it's world famous, particularly in the area of speech motor skills, very well known. And the day I walked in the door, I picked up a team of 13 specialists that began to try to diagnose and treat my condition. And the first thing they were concerned with, of course, was cancer. Because of the pressure that I was feeling in my throat, they were concerned that I had tumors growing there. And so they put me through extensive cancer tests for the next almost 3 months. We went through all kinds of things. I tease with folks now and I tell them I think I had CAT scans and dog scans and MRIs and MTV, and I think we had it all at one time or another. And at the end of about 3 months of that, my lead physician came in and he sat down with me and he said, Duane, I don't know what it is yet, but I can tell you what it is not. And it's not cancer. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you thought it might be, but the relief that comes when you find out that it's not the C word is a wonderful thing. And I said to my physician, I said, well, Doc, that's great. Thank you for that. What do we do now? It's coming up on May, June. And he said, let me ask you this. Would you consider taking a leave of absence from your church? I said, surely, I would do that. If I need to do that, why? He said, well, Duane, sometimes stress can create this kind of symptom. And it may simply be that you're just stressed out. I mean, you know, preachers work so hard on Sundays and Wednesdays, and you may just absolutely be burnt to don't you dare laugh at that. You may just absolutely be burnt to a frazzle. And I said, well, let me go talk to my church. Let me see what they think. So I went to my church and I told them what the doctors wanted me to do. They asked me to take 6 months completely away. They wanted me away from the church. They wanted me away from the community in which I lived. They wanted me away from ministry of any kind. They wanted me away from people as much as possible. They wanted me to be as silent as I could be. Now that's a challenge for me to be. They wanted me to absolutely get away from everything for 6 months. I said to my church, what do you all think? And they said, hey, preach, we're on your side. Go get well. We want you back. And I said, all right, let's go. So my wife and I left, and we were gone for 6 months. And we came back at the end of that 6 months. It's now November, almost December. And my voice was exactly the same as the day I had left the church. It had gone from the church. It was exactly the same. Had not gotten any worse, but it also hadn't gotten any better. And I became a little concerned at that point because it obviously wasn't stress. So I went back to my lead physician as quickly as I could get to see him. And I said, Doc, it obviously isn't stress. What do we do now? And he said, Duane, we've got a lot more testing that we're going to have to do. And he became very serious. And I said to him, Doctor, am I ever going to get to preach again? And he looked at me very somberly and he said, Duane, I honestly don't know. Because until I can diagnose what's wrong with you, I can't get you into a treatment program. And until I can get you into treatment, I can't give you a prognosis for success. I really don't know. And I said, well, then I need to have another visit with my congregation. So the following Sunday morning, I went to my church, and as best I could croak out what he had shared with me, that he could not assure me that I would ever have the opportunity to preach again, I told them what had happened. They said to me, well, preacher, it's okay. We'll work it out. And I said, no, if I can't preach, you all have been more than fair with my family and me. I mean, stop and think about this. That church had been without their pastor for almost a year, and they had been supporting us, waiting for us to return, and now the doctors are telling me that they're not sure that my condition would ever improve. I said to the church that morning, as they protested, I said, nope, you need a pastor, and you need someone to be here with you. And so we resigned the church that morning and stepped down. That was the hardest day of my life, boys. I know you're involved in ministry and pastoring as well. Everything I have ever done in my life to make a living was connected to my ability to communicate. And suddenly my tool chest was gone from me. You know, I am not a mechanic. I am not a craftsman. My hands are not my skill. That's not how I make my living. Both of my children were students at Baylor University at that time. I didn't know where we were going to live. I didn't know how we would eat. I didn't know how I would keep the kids in school. That was a most difficult time for me. But in my heart, I felt that it was only fair that the church needed a pastor, and they needed someone to be there with them. So we resigned. And a few weeks later, we had found a place to live in Houston, Texas, which is home for us. We were preparing to move, and on Saturday morning, 7:30 in the morning, there was a knock at our front door. I went down and I opened the door, and there stood that Sunday school class that had draped that banner in that first Sunday at the church. And they showed up that morning with bodies and trucks. And they're the ones that moved us back to the city of Houston. I went to Sunday school the next morning, and I sat down in kind of the right far corner of the room, and our director stood up and said, announced to the whole class, well, we went to Brenham yesterday and retrieved the Millers. And I laughed with her later, and I said, Sherry, I know you were teasing when you used that word retrieved, but believe me, that word exploded in my spirit when you spoke it. God dropped that word in your mouth. If Duane Miller ever needed to feel retrieved, folks, that was the time. I was at loose ends in my life. I didn't know physically what was wrong with me and all the other things that were wrapped up with that. I needed to feel retrieved. And I have the opportunity to share with people now, and I suppose it's very cornerstone of my message, is that that's what the church is supposed to be about, boys. We're supposed to be about retrieval. I'm not sure that we haven't lost our mandate and forgotten what God called us to do. You know, when visitors walk in the back door of your church, don't be guilty of turning around and looking at them and sizing them up to determine whether or not they're going to fit in. We're supposed to be out in the highways and hedges and finding people who don't fit and bringing them in and seeing God clean them up and change their lives. That's what the gospel is all about. And I'm afraid that we as the church, the body of Christ, and I'm not picking on any denomination, all of us are guilty. I'm afraid we've lost that will, that desire, that drive inside us to retrieve. And I get asked a lot of times when people find out that I come from a church of 24,000 members, how do you grow a church that large? You know, they're always looking for the gimmick, you understand that, looking for the hook, that little easy thing. And I just tell folks, you know, it's in the word retrieval. There are a group of people in Houston, Texas that learned what it means to retrieve people. I think one of the things that I am proudest of our congregation about is not the number of folks that we gather under one roof, but about the 20-some-odd missions that we support a full-time pastor and pay all the bills in Houston that are in the inner city and in poorer areas of the community where we support churches in neighborhoods. That's what the church is supposed to be all about. And I blow our horn about that because I think that's what God called us to do. That's retrieval in my mind. Went back to the church, went back to the Sunday school class, tried to figure out what to do next. Suddenly my wife is put in the position of becoming the breadwinner in our family. I'm sure there probably were times when she probably wondered, who signed me up for that? You know, when both of her kids were off to college, it should have been getting a little easier for her. But instead it was getting more complicated. It had been 15 years since my wife had worked outside our home. She had been trained as an X-ray technician before we were married, but when our children were small, we had decided we wanted her to stay home and be mom. We had been blessed in that she had been able to do that, but now she was going to have to go find a job. How would you like to put together a resume, go to a prospective employer and say, please hire me, I worked in this field 15 years ago, and particularly something that's as technical as X-ray? Tough stuff. But I want you to know that my wife is made of tough stuff. I am proud of my lady, and I want the whole world to know that she is a woman of faith, The Word of God dwells in her richly, and I am blessed that she is my mate. I never one time, boys, heard her complain about her lot in life. I never one time heard her grouse about having to go find a job and go back to work. I just saw Joylene square her shoulders and go out and find a job. That's a blessing.
Let me ask you about your medical specialist, because I understand you had among the best in the world.
I did indeed. All during the time that we are back here in Houston, the doctors that I am seeing are consulting with other doctors. They sent me to Philadelphia. They sent me to Los Angeles. I had consultants from Japan. I had consultants in from Europe. The finest doctors in the world have been mine. Luciano Pavarotti's doctor, my doctor. Pick a number. There is nobody that has credentials in that particular field that has not seen me. And the reason is because my case was so unusual. What the doctors were finding as we would go through this continual testing and going through different scenarios is that the vocal cords did not move. If you could look down your throat and dissect yourself and understand how you work, all the noise that you make comes through a hole about the size of a dime in your windpipe. And as air moves up from your diaphragm, there are some tiny little membranes that vibrate in that air. And there are muscles around the outside of those that move them back and forth. Those membranes are called vocal cords. Well, mine didn't move. They just hung there limply. That's very unusual. The normal thing, if they don't move, is that one or both become paralyzed and rigid. That's fairly common. But mine were not. They were just limp, and that is extremely rare. And so because of that, doctors from everywhere wanted to see me because my situation, my condition, was something they'd read about, but they'd never seen one.
Now, am I correct in saying that they had pictures, videos
Yes.
of your throat?
One of the things that they did from the first day that I went to see them is every time I would go to see the doctors, they would put a scope down my throat. They would hook it up to a VCR machine, and they would videotape what was going on in my throat. They were looking for changes and so forth. So they made a videotape that, in essence, is like time-lapse photography that takes over a span of 3 years, or almost 3 years. If you look down your throat right now, you'd see it come to a V at the bottom. And on each side of that V, you'd see a little bump. That little bump is a piece of fat, and it's called false cords. That's what those are. When you get laryngitis, the reason you sound like you do is because your throat swells and those little pieces of fat start beating together above the vocal cords, and you sound like this instead of like that. That's all it is. But since I could not use the vocal cords, they would not move, the only way I could make sound was with the false cords. And so mine changed in appearance. They are not designed to sustain speech, and they became very abraded. An abrasion is what you get when you fall down on an asphalt road and skin your knee real bad. That's what an abrasion is. Well, I did that to both false cords. They became very abraded, and ultimately scar tissue formed in those abrasions. So what had been slick smooth in the bottom of my throat became very rough and gnarly in its appearance. And all of that is on that videotape that they shot over a period of time.
And the prognosis was not good.
Prognosis was that I would ultimately lose the voice altogether. My doctor came back at one point in time when they finally settled on a diagnosis. And he said, Duane, what has happened? When you had the virus back in 1990, it got into the nerves of your vocal cords and it's destroyed the nerves completely. And he said, that's why there's no movement. That's why there's no response. And when I asked him for prognosis, he said the prognosis is 0. It's not coming back. If it was going to regenerate, it would have long since done it. It's not going to happen. And I remember saying to him, well, at least I can squeak. And he said, for a little while. But he said, ultimately, you're going to wear away the surfaces of those false cords to the point that they can no longer get together, and at that point, you won't be able to make a sound. You will be totally mute.
You know, I'm impressed when you read in the Bible that a number of miracles were on people who were so well known. For example, the Pool of Bethesda, man who had been sick 38 years, going to the same pool. The man at the Gate Beautiful, who was over 40 years old, going there. Everybody in Jerusalem knew about it. Exactly. John chapter 9, the man born blind. So for God to orchestrate the miracle in your life so that there would be no doubt, He put you first of all in one of the most famous congregations in the world, First Baptist.
Correct.
Then another very famous congregation. Didn't you tell me that Sam Houston was baptized there in Brenham?
Yes, he was.
So it's a very famous congregation there. Then He puts you in a situation where you are in contact with the most reputable and famous specialists in the world
Correct.
in this particular field, so that you're on everybody's charts.
I've made a lot of lists.
Yes.
Some you don't want to make.
And now I want you to tell our viewers how God orchestrated your healing in such a way that it was not a He was in charge of the whole
Well,
thing.
this is the part that is sovereign grace, and this to me, Boyce, is the most important part of the whole story. All of the background that I have given to you is to set up what God was doing. In the middle of 1992, April, I've been back in the church, back in the Sunday school class, trying to make a living, trying to survive, and I've been there for a little over a year. And the Sunday school teacher that we had at that time came in the middle of the year and said, listen, I need to take the rest of the year off. He had some business matters and family things that he needed to tend to. Now, again, you need to understand that at First Baptist Church in Houston, teachers don't take off in the middle of the year. Having served on the educational staff there, I can tell you that we work very hard at teachers committing to be there until October for the whole year. When you start it, you finish it. We used to even sign contracts to that point. So for that teacher to remove himself in the middle of the year was, again, very unusual. But when he did, the class came to me and they said, listen, would you fill in for us again? And I laughed and I said, gang, I can't teach anymore. It's too hard to understand me. And they said, listen, if you'll teach, we'll listen really carefully. And I said, well, I'll do my best, because I missed that, boys. God called me to teach and to preach. That's what I love to do. That's not just my vocation. That's who I am. And it's the most important thing to me in the world. So we experimented with some microphones, because I could not use just an ordinary microphone. My voice was far too weak by that time. And I finally found a headset mic that I could wear. By putting the windscreen right on my lips and screaming at it at the top of my lungs, I could be heard most of the time and understood fairly well, I understand, once you got used to listening to me in the way that I spoke. And so I went back to teaching the Sunday school class in April of 1992. Well, some other things had occurred during that year. I lost my job because of my voice, because I was working for a legal profession, and they were concerned that if I ever had to testify, the jury wouldn't be able to understand me, so they decided never to use me again because of the voice. Everything in my life was upside down, and I was literally in January of 1993, I was in the worst pit I'd ever been in. I thought maybe I could write. I started writing a little newsletter, which we call Practical Christianity. I'd started distributing that in the fall of the year. I thought maybe I could write a book. I had some Christian publisher friends. I outlined a book, fleshed it out, sent it off to them. They had written back to tell me that they would love to publish for me, but they couldn't because I didn't have enough name recognition. And with my voice the way it is, I could never do a book tour, which is what they'd have to have me do in order to recoup the investment they'd have to make in me. So it just seemed like everything was falling completely apart. And in January of 1993, January the 17th, I got up on Sunday morning and I went to teach my Sunday school class. And the lesson that morning is just good old standard Southern Baptist Bible book series material. If any of you know how Southern Baptists put all that together, this particular lesson went on the calendar in 1986. So that lesson was scheduled a long time before I ever became ill. And the lesson that morning, the meat of it, was from Psalm 103. That's where David says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless His holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all His benefits." And then he begins to list benefits. He says, He forgives all my sin, and He heals all of my disease, and He redeems my life from the pit, and He crowns me with love and compassion, and He satisfies my mouth with good things so that my youth is renewed like the eagle. Well, that's a pretty good outline, but I have to be honest with you and tell you I really didn't feel very benefited that morning. I was in that pit, and I didn't really want to even be there to teach, but I had to be. I was doing that morning purely out of duty, and that's the truth. But I started talking about the miracles of God, and the first one is that He forgives all my sin. And if you'll notice that sentence and that verb, forgives, is written in a continuing sense and in a continuing tense. God didn't forgive them, He forgives them. It is continuing with God. Every time I come to Him and say, Lord, I failed you today, 1 John 1:9 says, He's faithful and just to forgive me my sin and can cleanse me from all unrighteousness, and we keep moving right on down the road together. That's a wonderful promise from God, folks. I can't top that one. And I moved to the second point, which was He heals all of my disease. Now, boys, I don't understand all I know about healing. I've experienced the power of God in my life. But to say that I've theologically got it all figured out, I don't have, folks. And let me be very honest with you, neither does anybody else. And when somebody comes to me and tells me that they've got God all figured out and in nice, neat little packages, it scares me to death, because God is far too big to fit in any of my little boxes. He is infinite, and I am finite. My systematic theologies will never, ever contain God. About the time I think I've got Him figured out, He'll show me that He doesn't. I taught my class something along that line that morning, because that's what I really believe. And then I started to move to the third point, which is He redeems my life from the pit. Boyce, I don't know for sure what I would have said about the pit that morning, but I can promise you I'd have been good on pits that day. I was into pits and could have handled that very well. But I never got to talk about the pit, because just as I began to elaborate on that subject, God intervened in that class and performed a miracle. And I want you to know, folks, that that particular message or lesson was caught on tape, and I want you to hear right now what God did in my life, First Baptist Church in Houston, on January the 17th, 1993. Listen to this, coming up right here.
Because you have put God in a box both ways, and He doesn't want to be in the box. So the psalmist says, I'm excited, bless the Lord, O my soul. One of His benefits is He heals all of my diseases. And then in verse 4 he says, and He redeems my life from the pit. Now I like that verse just a whole lot. I have had, and you have had in times past, pit experiences. We've all had times when our life seemed to be in a pit, in a grave, and we didn't have an answer for the pit we find ourselves in. And I don't understand this right now. I'm a bit overwhelmed at the moment. I'm not quite sure what to say or do. I'm sounds funny to say at a loss for words. Thank you, Lord.
Duane, I think the first time I heard those words was on Dr. Dobson's Focus on the Family.
Yes.
But it just still moves me. It's an incredible story. What was going through your mind when this was happening?
Well, if you will listen again very carefully, you'll hear I say a few words when I say, you have had in times past and I have had pit experiences. On that word pit, all that pressure that had been in my throat for 3 years was suddenly gone, just like that. It was there and it wasn't there. It was nothing any more or less dramatic than that. And it startled me. And I paused. And I said a few words and I stopped again, and I'll never forget the first thought that went through my mind. I remember it clearly. Was this: is that what I think it is? Because I had been told that I would never hear this voice again. And when you talk, you feel yourself talk right here, but you don't know that you do because it's normal. And suddenly I was feeling sensations where I had never felt anything before, and my first thought was, is that what I think it is? So you hear me say a few more words and then pause again, and that's when I start to get emotional, because that's when I realized what God had done in my life, and that my voice had been healed and it was normal and it was there. I went back to the doctors a couple of days later. We went through all those tests again, several days worth, and when we got all done, my lead physician sat down in front of a video monitor with me and showed me the last piece of videotape that he shot of my throat. And as he looked at it, he pointed at it and he shook his head and smiled and he said, Duane, not only are you okay, I can't find any evidence that you ever had a voice problem. And then he ran the video and he showed me all of the scar tissue that had formed in my throat is gone. And it's as slick smooth in the bottom of my throat as the day it began. And he shook his head and said, in my line of work, I can't explain that. in your line of work, you can. Let's go with your line of work. And so we've gone with my line of work ever since, and it has been a tremendous thing.
All right, the Sunday school class does this every Sunday,
Yes.
the taping. God orchestrated this in such a way that there is not the slightest tint of manipulation.
Not at all. That particular Sunday school class has taped lessons for over 25 years, so that no matter who would have been teaching the lesson that morning, it would have been taped. But, boys, he had to put me in that class back in 1980, even though it was against the policy of the church, so that when I lost my voice, they'd come and retrieve me. So I'd be there when the teacher needed to take time off in the middle of the year so that I could teach a lesson that was scheduled in 1986, because in that church, they're the only Sunday school class that tapes Sunday school lessons. That, folks, is the sovereign grace of God.
And you've never wanted to merchandise this. As a matter of fact, I understand at this point, 1995, you've given away over 50,000
That's correct.
of those tapes.
That's correct. And we will do that as long as God gives us ability to do so. I want people to hear the message of the grace of God.
And you relate to the stories of Peter and Andrew, James and John from the standpoint that they were ordinary people until God touched their lives.
Precisely.
And you're a very ordinary guy until now. And here it is, November 1995, and you say already this year 10,000 responses to the gospel.
Yes. And that's a very conservative guesstimate. I am not one that goes around and counts every person that makes a decision, but I can tell you that that's a very, very conservative estimate. Those are the people that have responded in churches across America as we've preached revivals and conferences and so forth this year. And the Lord has opened doors for us that are beyond my wildest imaginations. And if He did it for any particular reason, it's because I am just average. I am just like you, folks. I am nobody special. I hurt, I have pain, I struggled, and yet God in His grace broke through and provided the miraculous care.
And to all of our discouraged viewers, you're perfectly positioned to point them to God, not to excellency of speech or to man's wisdom, but to the power of God.
Absolutely. I had nothing to do with all of this. My favorite phrase is to tell people that I just showed up, and I didn't even want to do that. There were times when I laid on my face before God and told Him I just as soon He'd check me out and take me home. Friend, I don't know where your struggle is. I don't know where your pit is. I don't know what you're in the midst of. But I do know this: God has not abandoned you. He has not lost your address. He has not forgotten you. He cares about you. You are as important to the Father as I was. And in the midst of my pain and in the midst of my struggle, the Lord never one time forgot where I lived. He was working a plan in my life, and it took time for that to work out. I would remind you that that man that sat beside the gate beautiful, Jesus passed him all during His ministry on this earth, and yet it was Peter and John that spoke the words of healing to him. God had a purpose in his life and a time for that to come to pass. The same in mine. Whatever the struggle is that you find yourself in the midst of today, let me say to you very clearly, God is simply not done yet. If you will believe Him, trust Him, hold on to Him, have faith in the sovereign grace of God, He will not abandon you. It has nothing to do with the wisdom of man. It has everything to do with the grace of God. And I just want folks to know that He loves them more than you will ever, ever, ever be able to comprehend. Look what He's done with my life. Who'd have thunk it, if you'll forgive the grammar.
God bless you, Duane.
The Lord bless you, boys. Thank you for the privilege of being here with you today. I thank you for that opportunity.